To talk about this, the president of the Independent Firearm Owners Association, Richard Feldman. Richard, we thank you very much for your time and joining us here on our anchor desk in South Florida. Let's get right to it. Is the anti-gun lobby going to pick up this tragedy in another attempt to suppress Second Amendment rights?
Well, that's always been their game plan. Use these horrible tragedies to push more controls against those people who aren't misusing their guns.
Richard, let's talk about where this young person obtained his firearm. Do we know that?
Well, from what I know at the moment, it appears that the .40 caliber Beretta he used was his father's. He's 14 years old. There's no background check in the world that he would have passed because he stole it from his father, which takes us back always to the first rule of firearm safety. Always keep your guns secured when not in use. And that certainly includes children in your family.
As we are finding out more about the shooter and his motives, it appears, based on reports, that he was emotionally distraught over what he hoped to be romances that failed to flower. And again, you get into a question of why, in the minds of some people, you go after firearms as opposed to dealing with mental health issues that young people and all people can confront.
I think the failure in our country ever since Newtown and really over the last 30, 40 years has been asking the right question, which is never about the gun per se, but always about in whose hands are the guns.
Richard, we know that Seattle and the Pacific Northwest have some of the most restrictive gun laws. There's been talk that if the teacher herself had been armed, there might have only been one casualty, which would have obviously been the shooter himself. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I frankly have some mixed feelings and understand how awkward it might be in public schools to have teachers with firearms. And yet, if we look at this tragic incident on that one day, at that one moment in time, would we have been better off had there been someone armed to be able to stop him earlier? And the answer is always yes.
We have heard so much, and I don't know the specifics on Washington State, but the late, great Jennifer Dunn served with me in Congress on the Ways and Means Committee. She represented that state. There was a lot of talk about gun-free school zones, and efforts were made to federalize that. I think New Jersey Senator Frank Lautenberg worked several times trying to attach that as an amendment to some continuing resolutions to try to get that passed. You mentioned earlier, Richard, your concern about perhaps teachers being armed, or exactly how that should work at public schools. But at the very least, this notion of, quote, gun-free school zones, should that be taken off the table?
Well, the people that misuse guns could care less that it's a gun-free zone, and the one thing that they know, if they're thinking about it at all, is that no one else who's paying attention to the law is going to have a gun to stop them. So it's not gun-free to the victims. So what's the sense? It doesn't really make sense.
If you had to put together a checklist, Richard Feldman, what you would like to see happen to deal with law and order, to deal with order and ending chaos in the classroom, but to maintain Second Amendment rights, what would be the Richard Feldman checklist in terms of areas of emphasis to follow?
Well, why don't we start in this country with the simplest first and work our way up? And that would certainly be firearm safety education. Our president, after Newtown, made it one of his talking points in his executive orders. I've seen no action, and that's the one that would take no federal tax dollars. It just takes the will to implement it. Let's start simple and get some successes under our belt.
The notion of education and awareness serving as possibly a preventative measure. We're 8 days out from a general election. Have you seen any evidence that the left has moved now to exploit the shooting last Friday in the political discourse, or do you expect that in the last 48 hours of the campaign nationally? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the gun issue certainly is taking an important subliminal role at a minimum in this election cycle, because of what happened 2 years ago in Newtown. Gun owners are particularly sensitive to and aware that so many in the Democratic Party, unfortunately, which used to not be the case, seem to care less about the rights of the law-abiding and not focused on the problem, whether it's the criminal misuse of guns or the deranged, mentally challenged individual. These are tough issues. They're not common sense solutions that the politicians on the other side are always talking about. If it was so simple, we'd have done it already. That's the problem. It's complicated, it's nuanced, and it affects our fundamental rights.
And in this day and age of sound bites and trying to oversimplify issues, Richard Feldman, you make a very valid point about the preservation of constitutional rights and dealing with these problems in the classroom. Well, you just heard what Richard had to say. What is your take? Do you expect the tragedy that occurred at that Washington State High School to become part of the political talking points for the upcoming campaign? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. There are a couple of other ways you can get in touch with us. For example, you can get us via the internet at newsmaxtv.com/comment. And don't forget Facebook, as you can go to facebook.com/Newsmax. Now, there is more ahead on America's Forum as we continue to revisit the major stories of the day. We'll get back to all of those following a Newsmax Now update here on America's Forum. Please stay with us.